So it's pretty unique. It's multiple parallel fermentation is the term for that, and it's very unique to the sake brewing process. It's a very laborious kind of way to make alcohol. The fermentations can last up to a month, which is pretty cool. And so a lot of this leads to the kind of unique flavors of sake. You get this long, slow fermentation that creates a lot of umami. You have kind of lower levels of acidity, which, you know, is comparative to wine. It's not very similar. It's actually much less acidic. But, you know, it's very soft and smooth for a relatively high alcohol brewed beverage. And I think it's actually the highest alcohol content brewed beverage in the world. And I could be wrong about that. There may be some kind of similar, more niche things in that, you know, amongst Asian countries that get kind of close to that 17 to 20% alcohol content.
And what and the sakes that we're bringing in from Zev Rovine, are they different from a lot of the sakes already in the market? And if so, how?
Yeah, so they definitely are different. So I mean, like the majority of sake, you know, uses cultured yeast. It's been developed by actually the government of Japan over time, kind of isolated different yeast strains from breweries over the years. And almost every sake will use some specific type of yeast, which they'll bring in that has these specific flavor and brewing characteristics, you know, how dry it ferments and sort of the aromatic intensity and the flavor profiles. So that's a pretty common factor for most sake. It's very rare to find sake that's, you know, it has native fermentation. Whereas with wine, a lot of great wine, you know, it's pretty much like default. You assume that it does native fermentation, but sake is pretty rare. So a lot of these sakes you're bringing in, or at least some of them use that. And again, like there's just not that many sakes that are using kind of a native fermentation. What else here? You know, pasteurization. It's very common for sake because, like beer, kind of it's similar alcoholic product. You know, sake can spoil very easily, so it doesn't have necessarily a long stable or shelf life. I mean, it's not very shelf stable, and so it's typically pasteurized a couple of times. And that allows it to be more protected against going bad, you know, in various temperature swings and things like that during the whole shipping process. So it's certainly not, you want to talk about like natural or unprocessed sakes, or, you know, whatever term you want to use for that. There are plenty of like traditional process, like modern sakes that are unpasteurized. But certainly it would be a thing that is more natural. The pasteurization process strips a lot of the flavor away from sake. So definitely the difference between pasteurized and unpasteurized sake is like night and day. So if it's unpasteurized, it does tend to have kind of a wild acidity. It's very wine-like in flavor. You get phenolic bitterness, which is a no-no in traditional pasteurized sake, you know, especially, you know, that's sort of changed in the last 20 years or so, but you know, sake breweries for a long time have been trying to get away from that. So, you know, other things would be like charcoal filtration. Again, you'll find uncharcoal filtered sake, you know, kind of across the market, but it's certainly more of a natural thing to not do that. And again, by not charcoal filtering, you have a lot more of the natural flavors left in the sake. It's also more, again, slightly more likely to spoil. So you got to be more careful with that. Let's see. And I think one of the big things that really stands out for me is the cultivation of lactic acid, sort of the mash starting aspect of this, because all sake, you know, has this mash starter, which is really important. It's really important in this process, the moto or shubo is what it's called, this early stage of fermentation or brewing. We want to make sure that there's plenty of lactic acid and lactic acid bacteria to kind of prevent spoilage from happening. You don't want with things like Brettanomyces getting in there and all these microbes that are kind of ambient in the air, like it can really destroy sake very quickly. So one of the common threads with the Zev Rovine stuff is that they're going to use these kind of older school Bodai Moto, Kimoto, Yamahai mash starting methods that kind of produce. They're harder, they take longer to produce, they're very finicky, you got to be careful. And you know, the results are you get this extremely complex sake with, you know, just layers upon layers of flavor. So it's pretty cool. And so that tends to be kind of a common thread amongst these products.
Right. So I mean, like who in Japan like drinks these? Are these like a very niche subset of sake production and consumption in Japan? Is it
A little
like,
bit.
is it going back in time, or is it actually a
Oh, yeah.
contemporary development?
It's sort of both. You know, sake has got, as it modernized in like, you know, the early 1900s, you started kind of got to shift away from these older styles, which could be pretty wild and you know, it's a precarious thing for brewers. You don't want a tank of sake to go bad, you know, and the margins are pretty small, and it's always been a problem. So, you know, with technology kind of invading the sake brewing process, you get more modernized, kind of standardized procedures. You've kind of got this movement towards kind of cleaner, less bitter, less funky sake. It's more shelf stable, where you can kind of ship it around a little bit more too, so you can reach broader markets. And so there's been that kind of movement away from kind of the classical sort of like ambient fermentation kind of style of sakes. And so, and even kind of accelerating this, starting around in the 80s, you started getting more and more of these sakes. They're like ginjo shoot being produced, which are very floral, very delicate, very soft. And to a lot of people, especially outside of Japan, and I guess in Japan too, this is kind of like your archetype sake. You know, these kind of delicate, low bitterness, clean, quick finish is like highly prized. And so these really floral sakes are just kind of pushed into that direction, though they do require a lot of hands-on brewing techniques, and they're not easier to make. You can't industrially make these. I mean, some brewers can, but it's not very common. So you've had this move towards that. And I don't really know what sparked it, but I've seen kind of this movement back to some of these older methods. I think the brewers are kind of leading that charge and kind of like introducing these to the public at large, and they're sort of like kind of caught on. And, you know, throughout all this time, as things have been getting cleaner and more modern or whatever in style, you know, a lot of breweries do produce seasonal sakes for mostly local consumption, where, you know, even a brewery that makes kind of like conventional modern sake, they'll produce, you know, X number of sakes per season that are unpasteurized, unfiltered by charcoal, you know, nama, maroka, genshu, no water added at the end, or very, very little anyways. And these kind of seasonal products that come out, they're very vibrant, very bold. A lot of people don't like these necessarily. They haven't actually caught on, and they're kind of extreme. You know, even from my experience at selling a lot of these sakes, because every brewery will make these. That I find that generally, like if you push this on the public, a lot of people will be kind of upset. You know, they don't like those. They're expecting these flavors that are kind of light and soft, low acidity, you know, clean, quick finish. And these like unpasteurized, unprocessed sakes are like the exact opposite. So what's interesting about this portfolio is they take that, it's kind of to another level. Like there's actually, these aren't just kind of your standard unpasteurized sakes. They're kind of a lot more going on than that.
And what's the connection between like the sourcing of the rice and the brewing? Because, you know, in the natural wine movement, people always talk about how you spend all your time farming the grapes, and the winemakers will say that as long as they farm the grapes well, then they don't need to do much in the cellar. But is it traditional in Japan for the brewers to actually farm the rice, or do they normally buy it? And in terms of the rice itself, is it in Japan, is it common to farm organically, or like what's the farming like?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as the first part goes, it's nothing like the wine industry, which, yeah, I mean, you know, good wine is made in the vineyard, and you get a lot of the terroir from that. The more manipulated it is, the worse the final product is going to be usually. Whereas with sake, it's a commodity, you know, it shares some kind of similarities with beer brewing and even like whiskey production, which kind of starts with beer brewing basically, where, you know, producers are shipping in rice from all over the place. And, you know, the vast majority of rice in Japan is, at least in terms of like sake rice, is kind of grown in a Kansai area like Hyogo near Kobe and all that, kind of north of Kobe. And kind of a lot of these breweries are centered around that area, which is maybe coincidental, maybe not. But you know, Yamana Nishiki is like the king of sake rice. It has been for 100 years now, and it's primarily grown in Hyogo, though elsewhere too. And so it's like half of the sake rice production is this one particular grain. And so it's a good example of kind of the industry as a whole, because every brewer from northern Hokkaido to further down south, even Fukuoka or whatever, is using Yamana Nishiki rice for their most premium products. So you got a really kind of ubiquitous style of this, like this ginja shoe that I was talking about earlier, that's very floral and fragrant and whatever. It by and large is going to use this one particular rice from kind of a specific kind of area in Japan. You know, Yamana Nishiki is grown elsewhere for sure. Everybody's trying to cash in on that, but you know, so yeah, they kind of ship it in. It's like a commodity. A lot of times they'll buy it in, you know, off an order sheet, like Washington wines. You know, it's like, I'll take my grapes from here and here and here, and this is what I want, and then ship it to Woodinville, and I'm going to make some wine. And it's kind of like that. And as far as like the rice growing, definitely not organic. You know, sake rice is already hard to grow. It's very tall compared to table rice, and it's more easily felled by the wind, lodging. So it's pretty common for, you know, sake rice farmers are, you know, charge a premium for this stuff. And yeah, they're using fertilizers on it. They're using pesticides and herbicides, and each particular sake rice varietal has its own kind of ups and downs, but generally they're more susceptible to this stuff. And you know, since you're selling to the sake brewing community, that's more of a niche market. Whereas if you're growing like koshikari, you know, the most popular table rice in Japan, it's a premium table rice. You know, you can sell it to sake brewers, you can sell it to the general public, and there's always going to be a buyer for it. And so yeah, it's kind of, you know, it's more of a niche thing, and it's pretty rare to find organically grown rice of any kind in Japan. You know, it's starting to increase, but it's significantly more expensive. And you know, you're going to get lower yields for sure. So that raises the price. You know, your neighbors, because rice paddies are individually owned plots, and they'll be, you know, side by side. One guy will own this plot, and the next to it, there's another farmer. You know, farmer B is spraying pesticides and herbicides or whatever, fungicides, end up on A's rice paddies. And so, you know, especially with some of these producers we're going to talk about today, I've noticed that when they have that control, they're kind of, you know, they're not maximizing the total area of their paddies so that there's some buffer between their neighbors and things like that. So it's definitely kind of a new thing to do organic rice.
So the
yeah,
sakes we're going to taste, some of them are made with organic rice and some aren't.
Yeah.
And do some brewers just have to work with the resources they have, so they will try to get organic, but when they can't, they'll work with other things? Is that kind of how it works?
Pretty much, yeah. It's kind of complicated. You know, organic rice isn't new. I just want to come back to that. It's not new. It's been around, but it certainly hasn't taken off. And organic doesn't necessarily mean high quality. So it does mean that's probably going to be more expensive, but certainly it doesn't mean that it's higher in quality. It depends who's growing it. Usually, like these producers here will contract farm, or in Akshika's case, they actually do it themselves, which is super rare. But they'll contract farm out to farmers that are able to do this, that are willing to do this, and there's some learning curve involved too. And so yeah, they try to find local farmers who are willing to do this. Ideally, that's kind of one of the commonalities to these producers, is they're really looking to kind of bolster the local community and bring that sense of terroir is kind of part of it, because cost wise, it's more expensive, and it adds, you know, sake, at least on the export market, is already very expensive. Domestically, they can't really charge enough for it. So, you know, I've seen a lot of information about brewers who try to get into it and they kind of step back away from it. It's not necessarily consistent. You know, if they get too big of a yield, say if they were doing organic sake rice, if they get too big of a yield and, you know, they have more than whatever brewery needs, then who are they going to sell it to? So there's that risk of overproduction. And also because a lot of these farmers are learning how to do this, and it's kind of a newer thing for many of them, you know, as the ones that really emerge and get better at it, tend to start charging more money, you know, and they have this premium thing now. Other brewers are wanting it, and so further raises the price. And so one kind of common thing that you'll see with organic rice for sake production is that a lot of times it's table rice. Because like koshikari, which I'd mentioned earlier, like Kikusui is a famous brand that makes Niigata sake. It's very light, clean, delicate. And they're like classic Niigata light and dry style. And they've got a pretty famous organic Junmai Ginjo on the market, but they use koshikari, which is a pretty popular rice strain grown in Niigata. But the reason why they use that isn't so much that it's like a Niigata strain, because it's a table rice. It's actually inferior in flavor profile in a lot of ways, or you can't mill it as much and all this stuff. But they use it because the farmers there can grow organic koshikari, and then what they don't sell to the sake brewers, they can sell to the general public, and they can charge a premium for it. So it's safer for the farmers to do non-sake rice.
So actually, so sake rice and like table rice is actually, it affects the product, the final sake flavor.
Yeah, significantly. And it's not like Pinot Noir from, and there's some terroir aspect where it's grown doesn't matter, microclimates, and there's some really highly prized plots of Yamana Nishiki rice and Hyogo, for example, that you pay extraordinary amount for. But yeah, it's more about, I kind of lost where I was going with that.
Like polishing, is the rice polished?
Yeah.
And
So,
does that affect it?
Yeah, premium sake rice, it costs more because again, it's harder to grow it. And but the rewards are, and it's easy to it'll fall over easily, generally speaking, because it has fatter grains of rice, than table rice. They're all pretty much short grain in Japan, Japonica. But from there, what makes sake rice different is it's usually bigger. It has more weight per 1,000 grains, which is kind of the standard. So they're fatter, usually more shinpaku, kind of your starchy core, which is what you need more of that if you want to get away from off flavors and you want to produce a better environment for Koji to kind of do their thing. They really need starch. So high in starch content. And also kind of another thing is that they mill really well. So, sake, typically you're going to mill it down quite a bit, or you're going to remove the husk, some of the bran or all of the bran, to get rid of those proteins, which tend to develop amino acids. You want to get to the inside of it, which will produce cleaner, fruitier sake. So, Yamanashiki is like the king of sake rice. And it was like, half of sake rice production almost is just that one type. And it's not because it's like Pinot Noir, it's Cabernet Sauvignon from the left bank or something like that. It's because it mills really well. It doesn't necessarily, they do have their own particular flavors, but you can't correlate it with wine grapes, which have significant, they definitely have their own characteristics. It's more about how they work in the brewery. Can you mill it? Does it break? Because breakage is not good. And, aspects like that. So Yamanashiki, you can mill it down to nothing and it won't break, quality Yamanashiki. So that's kind of where the whole sake rice thing, the rubber meets the road. How can brewers handle it? And how does it react with Koji? So there's some kind of microscopic details in there, like,
so what's Koji
penetrate? So Koji's Aspergillus genus. It's a mold. It's like a single cell fungus, kind of like yeast. That it's ambient in the environment. It's ambient everywhere. But for sake purposes, they use a particular kind, yellow Koji, and so they'll put it on the steamed rice. And at the beginning of the brewing process, kind of the first step, you put it on the steamed rice, and it sort of eats into the rice grain, gets into the inside, and it starts this conversion, this saccharification, the conversion of the starch, because the grain doesn't have any sugar, but it has a lot of starch, and so they turn that starch into sugar.
So is it kind of like a yeast strains in the sense that is older Koji better, or does Koji have to be fresh, or?
Not too sure about that. Generally, I think it can be dried, kind of like yeast.
So people make their own Koji, or they buy
it? Pretty much they buy it. I don't know about, I don't want to get too far ahead on myself on that one, so I'm not exactly sure. Mm-hmm. Generally with Koji, it's just it's purchased. Mm-hmm. And I don't hear a lot about, at least with sake makers, using their own Koji. It might be a thing. I don't know about it.
So the art of sake making is really sourcing good quality rice and
Mhm.
using koji. I mean, like the art of the brewer is really what they do when they have the rice already and they have the koji,
Yeah,
and it's how
yeah,
they process it after that point that they add their own imprint.
exactly. Because I can buy rice from Japan or even from California now. You can get some pretty good Yamana Nishiki rice and from Minnesota and stuff that's already milled, and I can make good sake. If I knew how. Um, Whereas like if I were to try to grow Pinot Noir, it's not, no matter how good I am of a farmer or what my site is here in the Puget Sound of Washington, I'm just not going to be able to challenge, Burgundy Pinot Noir or even stuff from Willamette Valley in Oregon. So it's kind of a commodity. The art, it's one of those things that you see with beer a lot too, where you want to make a certain style of final product. These toji, they know what the brewers, they know what they're going to make before they ever set out to make it. It's usually not an accident. It is, you do see more of that kind of sort of like, let's see where it goes sort of aspect with these producers. But in general, it's like, I want to make this type of sake, so I'm going to use one of these types of rice, and I'm going to do it in this certain way. I'm going to use this yeast, and this is how I'm going to go about it. So they kind of think backwards from the final product to like, what they need to, the raw ingredients they're going to need to achieve that, and then the sort of techniques that they're going to use to pull that off.
Oh, interesting. So could we move to talking maybe specifically about some of the producers that we have from Zev now?
Yeah, yeah.
So what's the first one that you want to kind of talk to us about?
Let's talk about Akshita.
Okay.
So Osaka brewery, kind of a cult brewery. People love them. I love them. They're one of my favorites. So they make the ones that we're going to talk about: Okshika, the Black Moheji, which is like a single plot sake, and then the Yama.
Okay,
And
so I'm gonna, while you're talking, I'm gonna see if I can find some images that I can share with everyone to look at the labels and stuff. So you
so we've got, yeah, I don't necessarily, I didn't take a deep dive into the specific products from these guys. Akshika certainly has a style that I think is more important to kind of know about what they do. Generally, like, they're farming their own rice, which is very rare. Like that's just not, it's not a thing that you see very often. And so I found out they have 25 hectares of their own biodynamically grown rice, which is pretty cool. Then they contract the rest of it out. They use a lot of Yamana Nishiki rice, which is again like the king of sake rice. Yeah, there you go. So they're definitely their big hit as far as like export was their little Bambi 1 cup, which is helped the brewery quite a bit, I think, financially. So they tend to produce Junmai only sake, mills. Well, milling rates vary, I guess, but the alcohol content ends up coming around 17-18% almost across the board. So that's kind of high. See what else. So yeah, organically grown. Like they're not using pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, which is pretty cool. Again, like they have the control over that because they're doing it themselves, and I think it works because people love them, and the quality of their sake is just fantastic. And they pretty much do Kimoto and Yamaha style for all of their sakes, which is, yeah, Kimoto in particular is kind of an old school brewing method, where it replaced Bodai Moto, which we'll get into later. But Kimoto it's a very laborious way of creating this lactic acid during the Moto, that mash starting process, where, very low temperatures, a lot of kind of like moving of the mash with these ores. You build up this lactic acid over time that protects the mash, so then they can start brewing and there's no like spoilage or anything that gets in there. So, and Kimoto kind of disappeared a little bit when Yamaha came about. Yamaha is more of a recent thing, maybe 120 years old. But Yamaha is basically kind of the same idea, but instead of doing all the mashing stuff, it turns out if you just kind of raise the temperature a little bit, you can propagate the lactobacillus, the lactic acid bacteria and stuff naturally. And over time, anyways, it takes about a month. but during the slow fermentation process, it sort of protects the mash. And so it's become definitely Kimoto and Yamahai are like, you know, sake and cider favorite things. People love it. I love it. It's when I first started getting into sake, that was one of the things I gravitated towards, because Kimoto and Yamahai, even though they're a little bit different, they share kind of a slower fermentation time. They produce these sakes that are kind of acidic. You know, there's more funkiness to them, a little bit more old world, you know, to use a wine term. Whereas a lot of sake, conventional sakes and modern styles are more of like a new world, fruity, floral, clean, low acidity. You know, if you're, for me, I'm more of a wine drinker actually than a sake drinker, believe it or not. And so I like acid. I like that fresh kind of finish. And you get that more so with Kimoto and Yamahai, and a little bit of that funk. So they Akshika kind of, that's all they do. And, you know, one of the other things that, again, this is kind of a common thread amongst these brewers in general. So we'll hit on that quite a bit. But Maroka, so they're not filtering with charcoal. You know, pretty much all sake is charcoal filtered. Maroka sake does not mean that it's, you know, unprocessed, but because a lot of conventional sakes will do it as well. It's like a choice to make more flavor and character in a sake. But certainly it's like, if you're going to make an unprocessed sake, it's going to have to be Maroka. You know, you're not really going to be filtering it too heavily. So, and the thing about Akshika that's really cool is not only are they not using charcoal filtration, but they claim to not even filter it at all, which is, some people I know in the industry that know a lot more about sake than I do say that that's impossible. I've been told that's impossible, that they all do it. And anybody telling you they don't, it's a lie. Well, I tend to believe that Akshika is capable of that. I think they probably, you know, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but maybe they're doing a series of like racking of the lees, you know, the sake kasu off, they'll settle and rack. And maybe that allows a little bit of that, the kind of oribiki, the stuff at the bottom that you don't really want into your sake, where things can go bad. You kind of remove some of those sediments and stuff. So really cool. Like they're one of the few producers that are doing that. I can guess at a couple others that might, but I don't know for sure. So pretty sweet. So yeah, Akshika, you know, loads of fruit, not very aromatic styles. I'm not sure, as far as yeast, like almost no brewers do native fermentation. So they're inoculating probably with some kind of yeast. I don't know what it is, but you know, they tend to have subdued aromatics, dry, lots of fruit. Every Akshika I've had tends to have this kind of green apple sort of thing going on, not your banana-y fruit that a lot of like your conventional sakes have, but certainly a lot of malic acidity to them, and just really complex. Just really good stuff, very food friendly. And I think this is a great brewery as far as like these unprocessed producers and products. I think this is a really good bridge and gateway for, you know, conventional sake drinkers to try something different and not be like, well, it's too much. Because some of these other ones can be a little bit extreme, at least in comparison.
Cool.
Let's see, maybe there's something else I'm leaving out here. Yeah, I wanted to talk about their age worthiness. So, and this is, again, it's kind of a common thread here, but sake in the conventional sense is like beer. It doesn't hold very well. It's not very shelf stable, even after 2 pasteurizations. So the idea is drink it young, drink it fresh. You don't want to age it. Like I have a 7-year-old bottle of Namazake, unpasteurized sake, in my fridge, and I'm still pretty skeptical that it's going to be any good because it's not at this level of Akshika. But so they keep up to 2 years of production in their warehouse, just a tiny brewery. So they're holding on to the sake for a couple of years. And then the Toji Kurumoto, the owner, Okusan, he releases it. He says like 5 to 10 years is the sweet spot for this stuff. That I would not advise people to take any sake and assume you can do that. It's just not the case.
So is this the sake we're talking about? The aged one is the one in the middle from the photo?
Yeah, Black Moji I think is aged. Maybe the Okushika 2.
This one?
Yeah, the one on the right.
So this is Yama.
Yeah, and I can't remember the differences on those.
Okay, and this is the Black Mohiji. I think this is the one that's aged.
And that one uses omachi rice, which is like, you know, really the most badass rice out there, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinions. So omachi is minuscule production. It's an heirloom strain. and it kind of grows in that area. Okayama, kind of nearby, is kind of the famous home for that. There's a lot of kind of false omachis out there too. I don't really get into that, but yeah, omachi is the real deal. It's one of those rice strains that's tiny production, but everybody loves it. Does not mill that well. This one's milled to 60%, so that means they're removing 40%, which is, you know, usually probably, you might find 50% milled Junmai Daiginjo level omachi, but not as common because it'll break more easily than Yamane Nishiki. But the payoff is that, unlike what I said earlier about rice not really having necessarily like exaggerated flavors of their own, omachi does. It's very herbal style. It tends to produce kind of an earthier sake. It really is badass. Like, I love, omachi is one of those things, probably the first kanji I ever learned was omachi, because I want to know if something's made with omachi, I'm more likely, probably I want to gravitate towards that. And so it's pretty cool. So I don't know where they're getting this omachi from, but somewhere nearby, contract farm specific plot, because I think we talked about this earlier, that they're using, this is a Moheji's, like the farmer or the plot itself where this is being grown. So that's single plot sake rice, you know, sake rice is like, it's not really a thing, you know, like it is with wine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty cool. You know, and so that was pretty savory sake, and all of these tend to have some kind of more savory than fruity, I guess I'd say. But yeah, you know, bright acidity, very dry, 18%, it's kind of higher alcohol content range. And so yeah, I don't know what else, but if you got any questions about it.
Let's move on to, what about the Kidozumi? I have a
Kidozumi,
photo
yeah.
here of the producer, actually, I can share with everyone. This is, are they called, sorry,
Yeah, but
are they called, can you see the screen?
yeah,
So, are these brewers, are they led by like a leader? Is that how it works?
yeah,
Like, is there a head brewer, kind of the way that you have a head winemaker?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's the Toji. I don't know if that's specifically pictured as the Toji, but yeah, there's the head brewer, the
Yeah, that's
Toji,
him.
very experienced.
Mhm.
Fukuju, Kobe Shushinkan, which is not one of these sakes, still a brewery I love out of Kobe. They actually have kind of moved to this thing where they have a lot of good brewers and they don't necessarily have a Toji, but that's pretty radical.
Mhm.
Generally, yeah, that's the old school thing. It's kind of like a hierarchy, almost like militaristic in a lot of ways, though they're not as, you know, maybe as aggressive. But yeah, these Tojis kind of pass on the knowledge to the Kurobito, the workers, and you know, the Kurobitos give them small tasks and kind of build up their expertise with time. And you know, it's a lifelong learning process. So yeah, Keto Izumi is cool. I am, you know, it's pretty much when you reached out to me about this, is like, you know, I knew I wanted to be a part of it because it's just one of those producers, and these sakes in general are just some of my favorites. And I mean, I remember where I was the first time I had Keto Izumi sake. So it's just one of those moments where I was like, wow, I didn't know that sake could be like this. I just didn't know. And I actually spent a couple of years, ended up bringing it onto the restaurant list of the place that I worked at in Chicago. And I tried fruitlessly for a long time to try to convince people that this was sake that they needed to be enjoying or that they would like better, because it's pretty intense compared to conventional sake. And so not everybody likes it. The people that like it love it, because if you've had enough sake, maybe you kind of get tired of, like, if you only drink Pinot Grigio, eventually you're gonna get tired of it, I would think. At least I would. And you might want to try something else. And that's kind of how I view sake in general. Keto Izumi is like all of these producers, kind of making stuff that's, you know, that's got a lot more vibrance to it. And there are reasons for that. And they've taken some chances and kind of over their history to go back to old school things. And they've kind of formed, they're the only producer doing this kind of hot Yamahai method too. So they're pretty innovative, even though Yamahai is kind of, their process is kind of old school. It's still very innovative. It's unique. And it allows their sake to be extremely age-worthy again, which is not something, again, when we talk about natural sake, which isn't really a term, you know, Keto Izumi and these other ones, they share that common thread of they're age-worthy. It's pretty cool. So you get this acidity, this very long drawn out fermentation, very few additives, junmai, so they're not adding any any neutral spirits to it, whereas it'd be like a ginjo or hanjozo or something. So they're not doing that, and all of this somewhere in there ends up making these very age-worthy sakes. So, and that's good news for a consumer too, or at least for a restaurant buyer, restaurant owner, because you can buy these and you don't, you want to move the products, of course, from a buyer's perspective. You don't want them to be sitting around, but you also don't have to fret if it's been sitting in there for a year. Like with COVID, restaurants have been hammered and they've got these perishable sakes and they go bad. And, even if they're sitting in a dark, cold fridge, a year-old daiginjo is going to be less aromatic in most cases than that fresh one. And that's a problem. So with these, you don't have to sweat it. They're bulletproof. And then once you open them, they last a long time too.
So they have to say, but the best condition is to keep them cool, like 33 degrees in darkness, or?
Yeah, cold and dark. I don't know a specific temperature as far as that goes, but definitely cold and dark.
Like refrigerator temperature is good.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like the Nama that I was referencing that I have in my refrigerator is wrapped in brown paper too, because you don't want UV light, just any kind of light. Fluorescent's bad. Which is very much like beer. So that's why beer is oftentimes in brown bottles, if they care.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not, oftentimes you'll get these skunky beers like Heineken. Heineken's not brewed to be skunky, but it gets light struck, and then it is, and it's sort of become known. They've just kept with it, the green bottle thing. And so, yeah, these producers, they're not reusing brown bottles, but they also don't need to, because they're doing all these other things that their sakes are kind of bulletproof like that. But in general, yeah, store your sake cold and dark, and drink it fresh, unless it's one of these, and then you can play around with it a little bit. So I'm looking forward to aging some of these. I'm going to do some experiments with this stuff and see, 1 year's time, 2 years time, 5, 10 years, how, I'm going to lay them down and see how they work. There are certain things you can expect with that, like flavor profiles that will develop. But we could get into that too if you want, but just kind of fun, kind of a geeky thing to try.
Cool. And so I guess the next one we're going to move on to is the Yisho. Is it Miyoshino?
Yeah, Miyoshino. Well, quick, because I got on this tangent here. I wanted to get back to the hot Yamahai method.
Okay. Yeah, what is that?
Kirozumi. So it's totally unique to them. So Yamahai is kind of like that Kimoto. Yamahai's mash starting method that's fairly modern, even though people call it traditional. It's 100 years old. But so Yamahai takes about a month. It's increase in the temperature during the Shubo stage creates lactobacillus, lactic acid bacteria, and lactic acid that protects the mash. So that's kind of Yamahai. Takes about a month. Funky, sour. It's usually sometimes sweet, but so the hot Yamahai. So I've heard about this, but I had to kind of look into it again. So they actually, it's kind of a warmer environment where they're brewing. So it's part of their terroir in a lot of ways. But it turns out this ends up making very age-worthy sake. But they cultivate lactic acid bacteria separately. I'm not sure how, but so they cultivate this lactobacillus, and then they add it to this mash, the Shubo, at an extremely high temperature. Like instead of 45 degrees for a typical Yamahai, it's 131 degrees Fahrenheit, more or less. That's really hot. And that's to help the saccharification process, the conversion of starch into sugar. But I'm sure it also helps with protecting it from spoilage. So they add this lactobacillus into there, and then it's just kind of unique. I don't know that at the end of the day it necessarily separates their flavor profile from a lot of the other Nama, Maroka, Genshu, Yamahai sakes I've had. But certainly there's a lot of complexity that comes about from it. It's very lactic in quality too. Like really, like sake can be very lactic, and this is one of those. And it's this particular one, this Tokubetsu Junmai doesn't do this, but they actually do Ichidan Chikomi, like a one-step brewing process instead of the traditional 3. So like they might be the only one doing it. I don't know. Maybe there's somebody else doing it. But that's for their AFS series and that's because it's for some reason it's particularly like age worthy. And so when we had that 30-year-old sake, they're doing that technique with that too. I didn't know it at the time, but that's how they're able to have these sakes they can lay down kind of indefinitely like that. Totally unique. So hot Yamahai, it's a thing. they originated it 50 years ago. They stuck with it, and it's pretty cool. And so they don't grow their own rice. They ship it in from all over the place. That's a Ginginga sake rice from that product, and that's a Iwate northern Japanese sake rice strain. Like you only find it grown in Iwate, as far as I know. And you know why they chose that particular strain, I don't know, but they source from all over Japan. So, and I don't know they necessarily stress organic. I think they try, but they try to do it without pesticides and fertilizers, and make sure they use plant only compost, which is pretty cool for what it's worth. So, and that's pretty much it for what I had to say about ketos.
Cool.
But really cool brewer, love them. Again, these are like A and B of my top favorite, top 5, top 10 favorite sakes. These are in that group for sure.
Nice.
So you want to do Miyoshino Jozo Hanatomoe.
Okay, I'm gonna pull up that image to share with everyone.
Yeah, so this is a Nara producer. So Nara is kind of like the birthplace of modern sake, which is kind of like a Buddhist origin thing.
Oh, where they have those famous deer?
Yeah, exactly, at Deer Park. I should have shared some pictures of you with my fiance. We were there last 2 years ago. It's pretty cool. You know, they're like tame. But so Nara anyway, not that area of Nara, but Nara in general is kind of, these guys are further south. But you know, a lot of ancient breweries, you know, historically good sake came from Nara, or at least that's before Nara sake and Kobe really took off, Fushimi and Kyoto. It was kind of Nara was at the center of the sake brewing world, which they're all in Kansai. They're kind of close by each other. You could like do all of them in like a couple of days, train ride from each other. But so Nara is kind of an originator of quality sake, and that started from Buddhist monks. Primarily, they kind of accidentally stumbled upon this brewing method of shubo. A lot of this comes back to the mash starting, the shubo or the moto, where monks discovered again accidentally that if you leave rice sitting in water, just raw rice, not steamed, but if you leave it in water, it kind of ferments sort of and creates lactobacillus, and you get this lactic acid in there. Then you can use that rice, steam that rice, and use that water in the brewing process, and it sort of inoculates the sake enough that you get this sort of, it's not quite a native fermentation because you still use yeast, but it creates this protective environment that the end result of it today, it died out because it's so funky, but you know, it just creates this very unique style of sake by modern standards. And so this died out because Kimoto came about, which is another moto method. And so it kind of disappeared. It easily spoils. Brewers are afraid of it, but it's a Nara-centric thing. There's a a group in Nara that specializes in it, that does this every year, and they all kind of come together and they make the Soyashimizu, the water, the Bodai water. I don't want to see the name of this. It's the Shoyakuji Bodaimono. So it's just like a group of brewers, which this isn't one of them, that kind of every year they sort of brought this back a little bit. Hanatomoe kind of went on their own path with this though. There is no standardized Mizumoto, or Bodaimono is the other term for it. There's no like standardized version of it. And so there's this, they do use native yeast, which is pretty cool. The brewer, that's super rare. Like Tamagawa Kinoshita Shizo of Kyoto, that's another one that's famous for doing that. And Kenbishi, which is a very secretive brewery in Kobe, which is one of my favorites. This brewer, Hashimoto-san, he learned from Kenbishi while working at Kenbishi how to do this native fermentation with just the yeast that are ambient in the environment. And his Bodaimoto process takes longer. He lets it go completely foul, like a week of raw rice soaked in this water, and gets all funky and stinky. And you can kind of smell that on the sake. It does have this kind of cheesy funkiness to it, which is really cool. And it's not for everybody, but so anyway, so that's what they're in Hanatomoe. When I think of Hanatomoe, that's what I think of. This particular one is actually, I want to say it's a Yamai with native yeast, but it's not a Bodaimono. So you could have fooled me when I tasted it. It's pretty funky, and I think that's that native fermentation thing, which is really cool. And they also use a lot of the Yoshino Taro, the they're right at the foothills of the Yoshino Forest. This is like famous cedar forest in Japan and Nara. That Choryo sake, the king of Taru sake, Choryo is awesome. But they make more conventional style. They famously use this wood because it's the best cedar in the country. And these brewers are on like the footsteps. It's like in lumber country. You know, they're right there. And so they use a lot of these cedar barrels for their fermentation and stuff, which is pretty cool. You don't taste it necessarily on the sake, but I think that's just because there's so many other things going on. So pretty interesting. And so they use a lot of local rice, but not entirely. Some of it's organic, but not most of it. So that's kind of most organic sake that's out there. That's kind of the story behind the brewery. Like they use it when they can, but they don't necessarily rely on it because it's unreliable. They do use when they can with some of these local farmers. They use ducks. Like ducks are a big part of the patties that are flooded. They kind of cover. They make it so they can't fly, and then they cover it with nets. And the ducks go around and they eat all these bugs and stuff and are like natural pesticide control or pest control. So it's pretty cool. And then they're fertilizer and stuff. So anyways, their sake is highly unprocessed. Nama, they're unpasteurized. Genshu, they're not adding any water, very, very little water anyways at the end, which is, you know, again, not standard. And then the Muroka, so they're not using charcoal filtration. I don't know if they're completely unfiltered. I doubt it, but they're certainly doing Muroka their sake. So again, all this leads to like more texture, more flavor, more acidity, vibrant sakes. Not necessarily funky, but in this case, because of the native fermentation, it is pretty funky. And I'd say of all this list, it's, you know, splitting hairs here, but this is pretty as close to natural sake as you're going to get with the native fermentation thing. So really cool. And food, you got to have these. These are food sakes. You want to have this alongside, you know, steak, salty, funky cheese, nuts. You know, I'm trying to think what else, like pasta, even anything with cream-based, dairy-based kind of foods, Western food, even pizza would probably be really good with pizza, especially like mushrooms and things like that, truffle. So definitely food-driven kind of stuff. This is like your funky burgundies. If there's the funkier burgundy that you can imagine, this is kind of in that sort of in that realm and just as complex. So pretty cool. And you don't have to pay $100 a bottle wholesale for it either, which is cool.
Cool.
Let's see. So that's pretty much all I got on these guys. So they only make Yamaha and Bodaimoto, all native fermentation. So that's pretty cool.
What's the next one?
Let's do actually the Yuzushu, the Miyako Bijin. So this is made on Awaji Island, which is a big island that connects the main island Honshu with Shikoku Islands through the straits. There's a big famous bridge that leads to this island. And so they're kind of like, I wouldn't say they're a co-op, but a bunch of brewers got together and then at some point in their history and formed this brewery. Kind of to put all of their might together. So they make, you know, handmade stuff, small batch, tiny production. I think their website is as old as the brewery. It's from like 1960. So they were pretty innovative when they made the website, but now it's like pretty rough. But as a blogger, I noticed that kind of things. But yeah, handmade stuff. So this, they only do Junmai pretty much, which again would be kind of more natural. You're not adding neutral spirit, which could be just about anything, you know, vodka-like stuff at the end or after pressing. And
so that's a thing, to add neutral spirit?
Yeah. So it's actually before pressing. But you know, you add something akin to vodka to a sake mash, and you know, it helps kind of dissolve some of the unfermented stuff in there. It lifts the aromatics a little bit, and of course, it'd make it quite a bit boozier if they weren't adding water later. But then they add water to it. So if you think like what vodka, soda, vodka, and water tastes like, it's like flavorless. So this whole Aru Tenshu kind of like, you know, Hanjozo, Ginjo, Daiginjo, they're very good sakes. And Futsushi, like standard table sake, relies on this heavily. But, you know, they tend to be lighter than Junmai-shu, which is pure ice sake. They tend to be a lot lighter, or at least in comparison. all things being the same, they're going to be lighter and they're going to be more aromatic. And they'll have a little bit of a burn on the finish, but usually they're cleaner. Like Daiginjo is like the top in terms of like if you're a 1980s, 1990s sake drinker and you shy away from these kind of modern funky styles or traditional, you know, Daiginjo is the best, right? It's what you want to have with your omakase, and they're very aromatic and light and clean as generalization anyways.
And
So
so,
Miyake Bijin is just doing Junmaishu pretty much.
okay, so this producer who's making the yuzu flavored one, they're not adding this distilled alcohol.
Yeah. And that was actually one of the things, I guess I didn't get to it in the beginning, but maybe we move back to that a little bit too. Like what is unprocessed sake? What is natural sake? And again, that's not really a term, but eventually there may be one that we don't know about that I don't know about. But eventually there will be some sort of like, this is going to blow up in my opinion. This is like the next thing. But none of these producers are making Aritinshu. They're not adding alcohol to their stuff. So they're only doing Junmai, which doesn't make it natural. It doesn't make it unprocessed necessarily, but maybe slightly more so. But that's a trend in general. The sake brewing industry is moving more towards Junmai sake. And whereas like in war era Japan, you had this move towards using this added alcohol because it increases the yields for one. You know, it's cheaper, and rice is a commodity and it's important to Japan. You know, Japanese government has their hands in everything and they control everything. And the innovations in the sake brewing world, a lot of them have come about through regional or national government sort of things. And so there's definitely a move towards like rice is precious, wartime economy, rice needs to be for people to eat. We need to make sure that people are eating enough, you know, have enough rice to eat. So there was this move towards that Aritinshu kind of style of sake, and it caught on too for its own kind of. It's not bad. It has its own, like I said, it's more aromatic, generally speaking, and it's lighter. And it allows brewer to make, in a modern context, it allows brewer to make kind of different products, because sake brewers will have immense number of different brands that they make over the course of a season. You know, they might have 20 different products. And so we only have access to a few here and there. It depends on the importer. But, you know, in Japan, you have these wide range from every brewery, makes a ton of products. So a lot of breweries will take X sake with this rice milled to this much with this yeast. Everything is the same. And then they'll say, okay, this is going to be the Junmai, this will be the Hanjozo, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we'll make this Junmai Ginjo and Ginjo. And so they're different. They taste a little bit different. And so now they have two different products basically with one effort. So one brewing choice allows them to change and have a little bit more variation in their product styles. So that's not every brewer doesn't do that, but you do see that quite a bit.
So how do people come to do flavored sake? Like this example of yuzu. Is that a more contemporary thing, or was that something people always did?
I'm not sure about Yuzushu, honestly. I don't know. I mean, umeshu is kind of a similar deal.
Oh yeah, with the preserved plums, the pickled.
Yeah, super sour, and then they'll add some sort of sweetener to it. And you know, so that's been around. So these aren't special designation sakes. You know, Yuzushu is its own thing. I don't know if you'd even call it futsushu, which is sort of your catch-all table sake, lower grade, additives, flavors. So like you'll see a lot of weird flavors sakes, like coconut sake, green tea sake, and that's all futsushu because you can't add that stuff to premium sake. Whereas yuzushu is it has more tradition behind it. You know, it grows especially a lot through southern half of Japan, maybe in northern Japan too. But like I have some yuzu trees too. But generally yuzu juice, sometimes concentrate, sometimes preserved yuzus. In this case, this brewer is taking fresh yuzu, unfiltered, juiced into the sake. So it's usually a sake base, and then they'll add, which is pretty common, or I think universal maybe even. But so sake base, very dry, and you know, pretty hands-off style of sake. So they're doing not hands-off, but you know, they're not manipulating it very much. Trying to see here, it's Yamaha, Muroka, Namagenshu. So that's all those things are like less intervention on the sake's behalf. So it makes more complexity, and that's, you know, yuzu flavor is pretty strong, and I've had a lot of yuzu, and I'd say they're generally, maybe I've never had them all side by side. Of course, they're all different experiences, but they all kind of seem the same. Very floral, of course, very citrusy, but floral, sour, sweet, light, very pretty. And then this Miyako Bijin has more. There's more going on. Plus, the label's sexy too. It's really cool.
Right.
But it has that little bit more going on, despite the fact that the strong yuzu flavor is there. So, and that is again because that's Yamahai Junmai underneath, and that's not impossible. That's other brewers do that too, but or at least use Junmai shu. But they're doing Nama Maroka, Genshu, and then they're fermenting it dry too. So they're not relying on sweetness of the sake to counterbalance the acidity of the yuzu, which is not sweet. And so they are adding some sort of sweetener to it. I couldn't find out what it was, but they are sweetening it some other way. So that's probably the only additive, unnatural additive part of it. But they chose to do that for a reason. I don't care what it is because it's the best yuzu I've ever had. So, and I'm not really a yuzu drinker necessarily, but this stuff is good. So, and so they do use organically grown rice on the island of Wajishima. Yume Nishiki rice, which is pretty good rice. I don't know if they're using it for this, but they do care. They're definitely a brewery that's producing kind of, they're on that cutting edge of organic and stuff like that.
Cool.
Pretty cool. I'd definitely be interested in trying more of their sake. And I almost went to this island too on this trip to Japan. I just kind of ran out of time.
Well, hopefully after COVID, we can take a trip with Zev and
yeah, that would
go visit
awesome.
Some of these guys. Because
that would be really cool.
Yeah, it's
these would not be hard to get to. It's not that far away from if you're going to Osaka, which is probably the number 2 city most people travel into after Tokyo, this is all in the Kansai area. So it's very easy to take a train over to Akashi and Hyogo, which is past Kobe, and then down. I think you might have to rent a car to get to Awaji Island though, but it's not far away.
Cool. We should move on because we're down to the last one, and this is I'm going to show a picture. This is one of the few Japanese brewers, right? Female brewers in Japan.
Yeah, one of the very few. Started very young.
Yeah, how does that work? Like, is it mostly male dominated just because there's no tradition of women making sake?
Yeah, because sake is seasonally brewed historically, especially, and so these a lot of times, and they do it in the winter time because it's cold. If sake was being brewed in the summer, traditionally it'd be garbage. And a lot of it would turn in ways that you don't want. So it's brewed in the winter before temperature control, kind of thing. And so you get these kind of seasonal brewery workers, Kurbito, going to the breweries, traveling to the breweries away from home, and they live in the brewery and they work. Sake brewing is a 24-hour thing. When it's going, it's going. And brewers, a lot of times they'll live in the brewery or next to it, something like that. And so, yeah, there's not really a place for women. Traditionally, women are staying at home and raising the kids and kind of keeping things in control. And they're doing a lot of the hard work for the household while the husband or whatever's their son's out there brewing away during the winter. So it's an around the clock thing. It's, I don't know, I wouldn't say it's like there's bad intention behind it. It just is what it is. That their family roles in Japan. And so it's become more of a thing where you can brew year round through temperature controlled brewing. So a lot of breweries will do that nowadays, especially the bigger ones. They'll just brew year round and in very modern style. But even then, they still will, like, not always. But yeah, women toji are killing it, and certainly there's kind of becoming some iconic people in the industry. So they're Fukucho, for example, is famous producer and brand, and you've got Obata Shuzo of Niigata, makes some more conventional style sake. But anyways, I think they're kind of becoming the leaders because they're just thinking a little bit more outside the box than a lot of these toji who are kind of older men. It's just a male dominated thing, and maybe they're kind of set in their ways sometimes. And now that there's been this big contraction of the sake industry, significant contraction. And so it's become apparent that you got to make good sake instead of volumes of sake. And that's kind of opened things up. So women have definitely a place in the industry, becoming more and more of a thing, especially at the top, which is pretty cool. So yeah, she's making, their sakes are not as, they're a little more conventional in some ways. Some ways they're not. Like, the nigori that she makes, Ko no Haru, which is very good. It's a lively nigori.
Which one is that? Is that the bottle on the left or the right?
On the right.
On the
Yeah,
right.
the nigori is unfiltered, or not filtered, but the cloudy sake.
So it's the one that has kind of like almost broken like grains in the bottle.
Yeah. So nigori, sake, seishu, technically that's the word. Nihonshu, seishu, those are the actual terms for what we think of as sake. And so by legal definition, it has to be filtered. It has to be pressed anyways, not filtered, but pressed. So you got to remove most of those sediments. And so this isn't unfiltered. Nigori is not unfiltered. It is filtered, but it can be coarsely filtered, or they'll filter it, they'll press it clear, and then they'll add some of the sake leaves back into the bottle. So that's what she's done. She's actually like playing around with how much sediment goes back into the product, tasting it. What does she think? I wouldn't say it's an usu nigori, like a thin nigori, but it's certainly not one of these thick, viscous styles either. So, and nigori is super popular. It's the gateway sake for a lot of people in the West. The cloudier they are, they tend to be more kind of ubiquitous in style. They tend to taste like sake gasu. Whereas like this one has a lot of complexity because it's a junmai, it's a nama sake, so it's unpasteurized, it's genshu, there's no water going in there. Though it's not super boozy, so she's holding back fermentation, so it has that nice sweet sour kind of thing going on. And it's Maroka as well, so no charcoal filtration. So pretty cool. And then, but she is using 701 yeast, which is like the standard sake yeast, or at least the most common you're gonna find. That's not a natural, there's no ambience about that. It's the most popular yeast. It's a foamless yeast, and it tends to create kind of a banana-y flavor. It's very vigorous fermentation, but not very aromatic. But still, so there's wilder, funkier nigoris out there. This one is kind of natural as it can get, I guess, but it's still pretty clean and modern in style. I think people are really gonna like it that haven't had it. So, and again, it's nice gateway for me, at least. I can speak personally that a thinner nigori was kind of my gateway into the premium stuff. Rihaku Tokubetsu Junmai nigori is a like Vine Connection shout out there. It's very good sake, and kind of nutty and pumpkiny and all the stuff going on with it. And it's not really viscous. And that got me thinking like, oh, maybe it's clear sake, something I should try, 15 years ago. Maybe I should give it a shot. And so, yeah, that's kind of what these are, cool bridge products.
And then what about this one on the left that kind of looks like a rosé color?
Yeah, Ine Mankai. So yeah, red rice sake or black rice sake. It's, there's a few of those out in the market, and don't know much about it. I know it's got a really nice structure to it. I would say in terms like, I wouldn't compare it to a rosé. I think it has a little bit more going on in terms of character, more umami. It's kind of a mix of umami and fruit, and kind of the fruit you'd expect to, kind of like red fruit driven, but also a lot of like just malic. It's got a lot of green apple flavors to it, but then a lot of like grainy kind of umami. So they're not, I don't know, I know almost nothing about the rice they're using for this, and it's not very common to use this type of rice. Certainly not Shizoko Tekimai, sake rice, but so there's some umami and bitterness and things that are going on with that, and not just color. It's not just a gimmick. It really does have some of its own flavor, and it's complex, that's for sure. It's not organic. It's kind of a local specialty thing, this rice strain, which don't remember the name of it. I didn't write it down either, but it's not organic, but maybe in someday it will be. And they probably can produce it if they lock in some kind of contract, some sort of deal, because this sake is definitely getting some attention, and you're seeing it more and more across the country. When I look around things online, it's in Australia. It's probably available in the UK now, in different parts of the UK, and maybe France too. So it's catching on, and it's more than just a novelty. So I think the most popular, if you want to, anybody just wanted to run out and try one of these, there's Tewatsuru, makes the most famous one that I know about, red rice sake. Significantly more mild and kind of like clean to whatever, it's good. But this one's got a lot more going on. It's a pretty cool product.
I want to open up for everyone on the call to ask some questions, but before I do, the last thing I want to share with everyone is this really cool drawing that you did to kind of explain how to read a Japanese label. And I'll email this to everyone so they can take a look at it. But is this like an example of how there's like a standard way to create labels? And so if you learn this, you can get a sense of how to read it. Hey guys, I think something happened to Brad.
Did we lose him?
I don't know. It was getting interesting. We need him to answer our questions. But anyway, I'm going to show you guys the label. He's doing some work on his website. It's kind of cool. Some educational stuff. So I don't think he's published this yet, but he shared it with us in advance to show us how we can learn to read a label. So
this is very helpful.
Yeah, I can send you guys a copy of this just so that you can have it as a reference. Let's see where Brad is. Yeah, I think maybe he's going to call back in. It looks like we dropped him. But did you guys have any questions for him?
I've been kind of vigorously taking notes and have plenty of questions, but nothing like right at the front of my mind.
Okay, well, I'm going to just text him and see if maybe his battery died, because I know that's happened to me on calls before.
I do have to jump off here pretty soon,
Okay,
but I did have one question if he comes back. Kind of like red wine, commercialized red wine, it's full of chemicals and additives, right? Like colorants, they adjust everything with, citric and tartaric acid, all this kind of stuff. Is there, in larger scale commercialized sake, is there more chemicals or additives or anything like that? And if so, like, what are they?
I think Luke, can you answer some of that? I think Luke's on the call. He's been feeling a bit under the weather from his vaccine shot.
Oh no.
I don't know if he's there, but yeah, from what I understand, there is a lot of different additives that can go into sake, including MSG, believe it or not.
Really?
Yeah. So I think that it's not uncommon, but yeah, I don't know as much as someone like Brad would answer. But if you need to jump off the call, no worries. We can ask him later. And actually, we're actually going to be trialing a podcast, and we're gonna do like a proper interview with him that we can edit and stuff. So yeah, so he's logging in right now. He looks like his connection, he got bumped off from his internet. But I'm going to save this conversation so we can revisit it. But also we'll try to do a more kind of structured conversation that we can put on a podcast. And I'll put together also an info sheet for you based on like everything we talked about, like the lineup of the sakes, and then links to the producers. There's a really good website called Black Market based in Australia, and they've gone and interviewed all of these brewers, and they have like really cool video footage with images of the winery. There we are. Hi.
Yeah, a second here. Are you there?
Hey.
Can you hear me? Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right, I'm back.
So I think Andrew needs to jump off soon, but he has a question for you about, was it more, what kind of additives can be put in sake? Is that it?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, in larger scale, commercialized sakes, do you see, more chemicals or additives in those products? And
Not at all.
Not at all? Are they all
No,
kind of
no
the same or
sulfite.
standard?
Now you can't, especially to produce quality sake. So Tokute Meishoshu, Meishoshu is like quality special designation sake, which is like everything we get in the U.S. and no additives. So you can add neutral spirit, like we were talking about earlier, the Aru10 stuff, where you can make a Hanjozo or Ginjo, but that's really it.
So
Otherwise, it's
neutral spirit or like water. What does the water do? Is that just sort of tame down the sharpness from the alcohol content? Why do you do that? Okay.
Cuts it down so it spreads the yield, lowers the booziness from adding that neutral spirit. Because if you're adding something that's 40% ABV, 80 proof,
Yeah.
pretty strong.
Okay. Cool.
So no,
Okay.
there is Naruto Tai, little Nama Genshu can that's famous, Drunken Snapper. That one's actually a Ginjo, Nama, unpasteurized, all that, and they're adding that spirit to it, and then there's no water, so it's like 21% alcohol. So it's pretty intense, but very rare to do that. They're going to cut it back down, so that's how it ends up being lighter. It's like adding vodka and water to sake, it dilutes it down.
Dilutes it, yeah. Okay.
So no additives allowed. Now, again, like that coconut sakes and all those new, you see a lot. Fuki brand makes a lot of weird stuff like that. That I'm not gonna say anything bad about it. You can make really good cocktails with it, but it's not quality special designation.
So Brad, I heard people put MSG in sake. Is that not true?
I don't know
I was
about
Googling. I
I'll
saw
have to
a
look it up.
reference to that, and it
I
seemed
feel like I've heard about that, but
no.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, the important
no.
thing is the high quality sake is pretty regulated.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure you could do that for Futsushu, like your table sake. But MSG, sake has the most umami of any alcoholic beverage in the world. It has this very long fermentation time, which is how that's all comes about anyways. And so it'd be kind of stupid to add it. I mean, you could if you wanted to make super meaty sake, but unnecessary. And so certainly I don't think you can do that for special designation sake. It's just rice, water, koji, yeast. That's it. And optional added alcohol.
Oh, and I know Henry had some questions for you too.
Yeah, far away.
Yeah, well, so one, I just wanted to repeat on, you were talking about what was required to make them ageable, and I kind of missed that little detail.
Yeah, so I think there's the common thread here is that it's unpasteurized. Generally, I know from my experience, Namazake, so unpasteurized sake is age-worthy compared to twice pasteurized. It holds up better because I just personally, it has more acidity, a lot more acidity.
Right.
And I think at least with wine, there's a thread there. So more acidic wines tend to age better as a general rule, and more tannic too. They tend to age better than wines like Viognier, which has low acidity, and which is also an aromatic wine, which the aromas tend to fade with time. So I think that's kind of the common thread, is that they have these elevated acidity from being unpasteurized. They have a lot of the flavor left in the product when they're, when conventional sake is filtered, it's pasteurized twice, it's diluted with water, uses Sokujomoto, which is just, we didn't talk about this, but most sake, they just add lactic acid into the mash, and there it is. And it takes like a week to ferment it. And it makes clean, fruity, modern sake, but it doesn't make long-lived sake as a general rule. And you probably could make it long-lived even with that. But all these things combined, I think, is why they become age-worthy. Certainly Namazake, your unpasteurized sakes, that's a good start. The more acidity, probably the longer they can live. And in this one producer, Keto Izumi, they're doing this hot Yamai method, and that tends to there's something to it. I think they put it through these hot, high temperature conditions, which some other age-worthy sakes I know of do that too, and they experience these high temperatures, and so they've already changed, and they haven't been allowed to spoil. So they've been through all these processes that allow them then to kind of develop over time. But it's not a thing. It's becoming more of a thing, but it's not considered common. And so if a producer is making sake that's aged intentionally, it's koshu is a typical term for that, like old sake, basically. If you just forgot about a sake in your fridge for 4 years and it's totally faded, that's not technically koshu. That's just faded old sake. But if there's intent behind it, It's usually called koshu. And
Do
like,
they age it in bottle, or do they age it in the stainless steel or the vessel, and then they bottle it when it's ready?
I've always assumed in tank for the most part, in stainless
Okay.
steel with enamel lining and stuff like that, temperature controlled. But these producers are doing it in bottle, I think. So, you know, keep it dark and cold, and bottle's fine. It can develop inside the bottle. You're not going to get either way. I don't know that you want necessarily a lot of oxygen contact through all this, and I could be very wrong. Definitely not an expert in aging of sake, but you probably want to avoid excessive oxidation. So I think in a bottle is a pretty good place because they're using screw caps and everything, and so they can be, if stored properly, they'd be preserved pretty well.
Mm.
And
So
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
the key to Azumi, you were saying, is the Yamahime, and that's
Yeah,
probably how
actually
they.
most of these are Yamahas or Kimono.
Okay.
They're not the
Okay.
same, but they're sort of similar results. And the Sokujimoto that I was mentioning earlier, where you just take lactic acid and put it in there, it's quick and easy and cheap and reliable and all that stuff. None of these do that. So that's a common thread there. And you know, those sakes, whether it's Kimoto or Yamaha or even Bodai, that tends to be more acidity, sometimes sweetness too, but more acidity, more funkiness, more character going on. So
Right.
it's definitely like a thing. Like you see it on the back label. Like even if you don't read Japanese, you know, the back label will have a grade to kind of talk about the sake labels. You know, it'll say like it's a Junmai, it's a Junmai Ginjo. If it's one of those things, one of those premium designations, it's going to say it. They wouldn't go through that trouble and then not mention it. So it'll say it in Japanese on the front and then in English on the back. And then if it's like a Yamaha or something like that, or a Kimoto or Bodaimoto, they'll put that on there too, because that's, you know, they're not mutually exclusive. Every sake will have a grade, and then these other things, it can also apply as well. So like Namazake, Muroka, unfiltered, Genshu, undiluted. So all that stuff are things to look for. And it can be confusing because they'll put the name of the sake in there too. So if you don't recognize the terms, it's kind of hard to tell. Like, where does the name and the brand end, and then these other things begin? But usually the more of those things that are on the label, the more funky and wild and acidic and all that stuff the sake will be, generally speaking.
Gotcha. That kind of takes me to my next question, was just really about the term natural sake. I mean, you said it a few times, it's not really a term, but I guess my question is more about like the marketing, or how to approach customers about it, or how to kind of encapsulate the attitude shift that these embody.
Yeah.
Succinctly.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that. So, and it's not a term. Natural sake is not a thing. It's not necessarily directly, you can't translate it directly from natural wine, where like native fermentation is assumed as a natural wine.
Right.
Whereas with sake, native fermentation is like, you can count the brewers doing that on one hand. So even a lot of these brewers probably not doing that. And you know, from a buyer's perspective, spent a lot of years doing that. It's natural wine, and you can get into trouble with that because a lot of people, like me included, at least at one point in time, I was like, no, natural wine's too much. I mean, it was Walden Selections that actually changed my mind about some of that. But I was pretty against it, if anything. I was like, why would we change? This is going back, doing these processes is more likely to hurt a wine than help it. So you got to be careful. I'd say that they're pretty unprocessed for the most part. They still take it, and they actually probably, it's an oxymoron because it takes more work to make this style of sake. It's more difficult, more hands-on, more danger of things going bad. But at the same time, yeah, I think they're not for everybody. So you got to be careful with that. They're going to have, a lot of times there's a residual sugar sweetness to them at first, and then there's a lot of acidity. Both of those things, like at higher levels than most people are accustomed to. And the more you drink these sakes with that high acid, the more that residual sugar goes away. You know, they all seem dry after a few sips. In the case of Akashika, they're just dry. You don't even have to worry about that. That's why I think that one's a really good, like if you can get a buyer, if you can get somebody into an Akashika, then you can get them on this other stuff too. But I think the selling points are, yeah, they're, you know, for how much work goes into them, they're no more expensive than anything else. Even though these guys are risking, and ladies are risking their breweries on this kind of risky risky idea. They're more flavorful. They're for customers who've tried a lot of different stuff and they want to try something different. They're not for your like old couple that sits at a sushi bar and wants daiginjo only. Those people exist, and you try to serve them these things, and they're going to hate you for it. So as a
Do you
server,
think that even Japanese, like a lot of Japanese chefs, they wouldn't be interested in this stuff?
Yeah, because Japanese chefs are old school, generally speaking. Not a lot of them, in Seattle, there's quite a few that are pretty cutting edge, but and they'd be receptive to this. But a lot of old school Japanese chefs, they are, ginjoshu blew up in the 80s, fruity, floral, aromatic, light, clean, very compact sakes. And that's the gold standard to them. And they haven't really gone past that. That's it. And so when you bring them these sakes that are like, this stuff was probably pretty common, 100 years, more than 100 years ago. And so they haven't even experienced it. It's just not within a lot of people's frame. And so Nama Genshu Maroka sake is not uncommon. Like I said earlier, every brewery makes one. Usually like in the spring, they'll release these sakes. They'll release several over the course of the year usually. But they'll still be Sokujo Moto, where they're adding the lactic acid directly. So quick, easy, safe fermentation, not complex in comparison. They can be made with definitely not organic rice. And so they're still making things conventionally. They just decide to take some of their sake and not pasteurize it, and not filter it too heavily and all that stuff. And so those sakes have been around, and I think the chefs know about those, and buyers sometimes know about those sakes, and they can be hit or miss with customers in general because they're acidic, they're bitter. They don't pair with a lot of the stuff that you normally think of sake pairing with. They kind of have their own thing going on as far as pairing goes too. So they can be tricky. And so you do get some negative feedback from some customers who only drink low acid aromatic styles of sake and stuff. So if they associate those two together, that might be as far as they get mentally, and people make up their minds sometimes before they try something, what it's going to be. So I think, just kind of unprocessed, super modern, cutting edge, because really, even though they're going back to old school, this is very modern stuff that these brewers are doing. And organic matters, people like that. It's local, there's a terroir involved.
So we could almost call it,
these sakes can sell.
Right. Could we call it like new wave sake? I wonder if there's a way we could come up with a term that, is it a nouveau vague, kind of like a new trend? I don't know. It's just interesting because I know that Zev said that he was introduced to these sakes, and he says that some people call them pure sake, but he doesn't like that term at all. But he's used it on his website because, he says he just hasn't found the right term. And I noticed that in the kanji, like I read Chinese, and it's really interesting because if you look at the characters, it means pure, but it also means like, it like when you look at the characters, I feel like it conveys the meaning better, but the word pure doesn't. It's pure.
Yeah.
Implies the opposite is impure.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, yeah, pure is why I don't like that term, even though I think it does kind of make sense. Is for one, it's pure rice junmai. Pure rice sake it's already an established term. And so there's going to be a lot of confusion between junmai, pure rice sake, and pure sake. Right. And again, there's not necessarily pure about it. It's not a bad term. I think it works.
I think in Chinese, the characters, they sound more literally like whole rice grain sake, which I feel like maybe does convey that idea more, but it doesn't really roll off the tongue easily. So I guess there is no shorthand that, like, I don't know, Henry, how would you talk about these to your customer?
Well, I think the question I'm kind of asking is like, what can be communicated is, would you say that the attitude shift or the volition behind this older style is the same kind, even though the processes are not analogous? It's the attitude of natural wine and these types of sakes that's what's in common.
I think so. I mean, there's a movement back towards more natural products, and organic kind of fits pretty well into that, especially here in Seattle. I think if you can stress it's organic, that's a good thing, or
Well,
at least that they're not using pesticides and stuff. And then, you know, sake for a long time has really been a commodity sort of style thing, brewed like beer, where you get your hops from here, you get your barley from there, and your malt from wherever, your wheats from here, and there's no sense of place to that whatsoever. So these breweries are really moving back towards, and some other breweries too that make modern processed sake do this too, but it's become increasingly rare to have a local rice brewed sake with local workers, you know, all that stuff, and really taking care to make sure that there's no garbage getting in there, because sake is very clean and has all these great things, but you know, sake rice production involves a lot of pesticides, a lot of herbicides, and you know, this rice just easy for it to something to go bad. And if it gets knocked over by the winds, not, you know, that's a separate matter, but it's destroyed. And you know, bugs can be a disaster, and they like certain types of rice more than others too. And so you're removing all those aspects, I think, is pretty cool. And then you can sell it as a place. Like, I don't think the Kidoizumi is from Chiba, and then they're getting the rice from all over. It's got its own cool story, but it's not like a local, doesn't have that terroir thing to it. Akashika is a cult. I think there's something here because Akashika is super popular in Japan. It's, you know, it's everywhere. If you go to Osaka, you're gonna find it everywhere. Even though they're tiny production, everybody wants to have it. It sells here, in my experience. It sells very well in Seattle. Maybe because it's dry. That's like people want to hear dry. So if it is dry, sell it that way. You know, and that gets into the sake meter value, the SMV level. If you can find that information about these, which I did not, that's like a plus minus scale. It's like attenuation. But if you get into these like +5s to +10 or higher, those are very dry sakes. And that's always a good sales point. People really like dry. And but anyway, so Akashika, Osaka, not a place known for a lot of sake brewing, and they're growing their own rice, and they're doing it organically and biodynamically, and that's pretty damn cool. And it just tastes good. I think if you can get people into this terroir driven, like everything is done within 10 miles of the brewery kind of idea, I think these other ones are easier to sell too.
But you know, I think that, Henry, that is a commonality. I mean, I feel like that was what interested Zev and these producers, is that it was a similar response to industrialization that happened, you know, maybe in more like post-war. Like, it started in the war with rationing, but even in Europe, there was this kind of 1950s and 60s when petrochemicals became kind of a you know, really part of agriculture as a new style of farming. And I think
US
and I think it happened everywhere. And I think that these brewers are coming from, like, they're wanting to revisit this pre-industrialized form of sake production. So even if they're not able to do every level of it, they're definitely trying to harken back to producing sake that goes back to the pre-commercial commodity driven sake production.
Yeah, the pre-Miller Lite days of sake brewing.
Right.
And sake has taken a big hit domestically. A lot of that Futsushu stuff, the lower grade table sake, has kind of vanished. There's been trend changes away from sake and domestic in Japan. And so there's been massive consolidation, breweries disappearing. Really what remains are good breweries. There's really not, like, you know, a lot of bad sake breweries in Japan that make inferior quality products. So all of these are good. You know, I think where these are different is they really focus on that local, you know, yeah, like you said, this is agriculture, that they're not dumping a bunch of stuff on there. We don't know the ramifications really from all these chemicals. You know, I know people out here care about organic and local and sustainable and all that stuff. And this is about as good as you can get as far as that goes. And that's pretty cool.
Well, maybe it's not, maybe with consumers, it's just about making the distinction, because it's not that it's the same kind of native fermentation, but there is the natural aspect of it. There is the organic, and there's the organic, there's the lack of processing. Like, if that's what maybe a natural sake is referencing, you can make that distinction clearly, then maybe
you're gonna rub a lot of people the wrong way using that term, natural sake. I think you know,
they don't like it.
People are pretty dogmatic about sake, and you know, you get that in wine.
Yeah, sure.
I've been there too. I've been that guy. When I first learned about get onto sake too, pretty gung-ho and full of dogma and all this stuff. And, I'm creating a website where I'm like writing it basically for myself for 3 years and using kind of jargon and niche terms and stuff. I realized, for one, that didn't produce results. So you gotta, and from years of being a server and then a buyer and a sommelier and all this stuff, you can't use jargon and technical terms if you're trying to sell effectively. You really need to kind of speak in terms that can work for whoever your customer is, whether that's the buyer or the person who's sitting down at sushi bar or what have you. So, yeah, natural means different things to different people. In some ways, this is kind of equivalent to natural wine. In other ways, it's not. It depends. And as far as sustainability of shipping a product, 5,000 miles, I don't know about that either. But, and they almost always use cultured yeast. That's pretty standard. Some of these producers don't. Tamagawa is a really cool brewery or brand that's also doing natural stuff, and Kanbishi, where they're native fermentation. I think, each sake is a little bit different on selling it. I'd say these are unique. I think they have more brightness and freshness is a good term instead of acidic. Especially Japanese people, you start talking about acidity, then I like it. If you say it's fresh, it's vibrant, they might be more approachable. I really think these can sell in a wine environment. I'm waiting for that breakthrough to happen, where bars are carrying Japanese whiskey. So wine bars and, wine focused places. And we tried this at Sea Star when I worked there too. And I know they still, as last I know, they've had some sake on the menu. It can sell. I think eventually that'll become a thing. It's like it's its own category, sake compared to wine. It's its own thing. But if for a wine drinker, trying sake, I can think of Master Sommelier used to be a regular of mine. Hated sake. It's low acid. It's grainy. It just didn't have that complexity that he was looking for. But then again, I don't think he ever tried sake like this. He never tried a sake that had a super low pH, that's sour, that has acidity like what's their name here? Kito Izumi, one of their sakes that I've had has, a Riesling level of acidity. So that's, that changed somebody's mind. So I think that you kind of got to look maybe for diverse buyers on this and look for different markets that might not normally, not normally sell sake, and then educate the buyers on what it is as best you can. Let them know why this is different and why this might actually work. And that, hey, if it doesn't sell right away, it's okay, because the sake are kind of bulletproof in comparison. And one other note about sake that's important, and sake in general, is that it doesn't last very long. These do, but once you open sake, it's pretty strong. It's tough. It's durable. Very delicate aromatic sakes like Daiginjo are the exception, because the aroma will fade first. The flavor will stay there. It won't really fade. Usually you have about a week once you open a 720 milliliter bottle. The aroma will go down over the course of a week, possibly. And that's, death. That's killer for a Daiginjo. For these sakes, you can open it and a month later, it's probably fine. Maybe if there's an ounce left in the bottle, you've been serving it, pouring little bits over time, introducing more and more oxygen to it. Yeah, maybe it won't last a month, but once these are open, they're good. You're pretty safe. So they're expensive for a buy the glass program, but they you can put them in flights and integrate them. Sushi Capitano, we sold a lot of this style of sake at this price range like crazy. Our best sellers. We could sell a case of Nama a week, and 12, 24 ounce bottles a week by having a sake flight. So Nama flight really sells. People like it. Or you can fit a Nama into a conventional flight with different styles of sake, and people are gonna be like, "Whoa, what is this?"
Henry he's opened two little shops in the International District, and one is going to focus on more like everyday stuff, and the other one's going to be a little bit more for like nice natural wines and kind of more like artisan products. So it'd be fun to have it in the ID too, I think.
Yeah, I think it'd
Yeah,
be a cool
I'm hoping to
experiment.
kind of get both markets, like the wine buyers, the people who are coming to the neighborhood to buy sake already, like they know they're in the neighborhood to look for. So anyways, go
Absolutely.
ahead.
That's what I think that's your biggest like potential new area of customers. You know, sake drinkers are going to come onto this style more and more with time. Younger drinkers tend to gravitate towards it more than your, 70-year-olds who again have made up their mind what sake is and what it is. And so it's tough. It's a battle out there sometimes to try to sell these products. These are a reasonable price point though. Like, anything under $30 per 720 milliliter bottles. That's pretty much what you're going to expect out of quality sake, and some of them are more expensive. So now there's a strong correlation with price and style of sake. So these daiginjos and junmai daiginjos, these highly polished rice sakes, these top tier grades, they're very fruity and light and aromatic and stuff. But you're throwing away half the rice to make these, for example. So they cost more money. So more expensive sakes are usually assumed to be fruitier. So you can run into that issue with some of them. That's not really an issue with these because they're kind of in that junmai price range where it's like 25 to $30. That's kind of your killer price point for like an earthier style sake. So it shouldn't be too much of a worry, as far as that goes. They're kind of expensive for by the glass, like I said, but I think bottle sales, $70 to $80 is just like a magic price point for on premise, up to 85 maybe, and you can sell these all day long if you got a staff that knows what they are. So I think you got to educate the staff too, for on-premise stuff, or for retail, you're educating the buyer, and you just hope they pass that knowledge on. But if you can give them samples and be a little bit generous with that, so that not just the buyer but the staff gets to try it, you'll get someone in there who's like gung-ho about it and will push these products and stuff. So just make sure that people are refrigerating these.
I gotta hop off.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, man, thanks for joining.
This has been amazing. I mean, I took like as many notes as possible, and I'm sure that all questions are just going to keep popping up. But this was really great.
JapaneseBar.com. So just Brad at the JapaneseBar.com.
I'll send along Brad's info so you can follow up with him directly if you have any more questions.
Yeah, hit me up.
Great. That'd be super awesome. I'm gonna have some. They're already brewing.
Great. Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey Brad, thank you so much for joining us. We recorded this, but I think some of the recording also, I don't know if the beginning part got recorded, but I was thinking if you're up for it, maybe we should do like how I mentioned that we have someone on our team who's a sound audio engineer. Yeah. So what I was thinking, if you're interested, maybe what we should do is I'm going to save this for some like just people who are interested to watch it. But if you're interested, I was thinking maybe we could do it another time, but and we can invite Alex, who's our sound engineer, but he's super into sake. We could have him as like our audience. We could re-record, we could do this again, but what we could do is have you record the audio on your iPhone or whatever. Do you have an iPhone?
I have a Google Pixel.
It doesn't matter. He'll tell you he has some, like there's some, every phone he says has like an audio recording like app. And so he'll tell you which one. And he said that what we could do is we could record that conversation at the same time that we do the video. And then what we could do is he could edit that. He could take those two files from me and you, and we could edit it into like a high grade podcast.
Okay, that'd be awesome.
And then we could give it to you if you want to use it for, you put it on your website or something. But then, because I feel like we had enough technical issues with this one that maybe it's better to, you know what I mean? Like, and what I will do in the meantime is I'm going to work on the images to put them in a way that I can show them in a really smooth, like maybe a PowerPoint way, so that it looks good while you're talking. And then then what I can do is have a picture of the brewer and then the bottles next. So it's one image of the brewer and the bottles.
I've been wanting to get into video and podcasting and stuff. It's kind of I think especially the audio thing is it's kind of the next frontier.
It is, right. And so that's why I kind of feel like instead of uploading this one. I think we should just use this as like a dry run. And what I want to do though is I want to share this video with Zev, the importer in New York, because I think maybe there's a way he could partner with you to do something like this with his team. He may not need to, because I know they went to Japan anyway, but I just feel like you have a lot of knowledge that it might be a resource for other people. But I think it'd be cool since we're doing this. I just feel like it would be worth maybe doing another run of this with better, just do it a little bit better quality.
Yeah.
And then also give Alex a chance to record, to take the audio sound. And because we're piloting the idea of doing a podcast, so we could use this to, because I know he's very good with the editing part. And what that would allow is the recording would be the video. But what Alex said he can do is he can actually clean up our conversations in a more sophisticated way and like actually condense the conversation. So he'll take out even like ums and ahs and really concise, make it more concise. And
Cool.
you know, I think that's the most people who are going to consume it would be in a podcast form, because they can listen to it when they're in the car and stuff.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah, I love it. Let's do it.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. I'm gonna just save this for some of the folks who wanted to join us, who just want to get it quick and dirty. But I'll talk to Alex next week, and then maybe we can schedule a time next weekend or something to kind of do it again. And we'll just make it more like, we'll just have it more like, what did you disconnect because you lost your battery, or was it like just?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, that's happened to me as well.
I thought you were, I saw it shutting down on the screen. I was like, oh no, you lost power. And then it was like, oh no, it was me. that's not good.
That was exactly what I thought, because that's happened to me as well. So, okay, so next time we'll make sure we're both plugged in.
Yeah, I'll try. Okay. Of course, I went to bed knowing that too last night. I didn't charge my phone.
No worries. That's cool.
I can't do it next weekend.
No, it doesn't. It's no rush. We'll find a date that suits everybody.
Sounds good. Okay. I'd like to do it sooner rather than later. But
exactly. So you just you give me some dates, and I'll make it happen.
We do the following weekend.
Okay, let's pencil in Saturday.
Tentatively, let's do that.
Okay, and I'll check with Alex and see if he's available. So it's the Saturday after next Saturday.
Yeah, that would be the March. Let's see here, the 6th.
Okay, perfect.
So yeah, I think that's good to go. Okay. And we'll communicate if something comes up.
I'll check with him and then confirm with you. But thank you so much anyway. We learned so much. Bye.
Cool. Yeah, have a good night. Bye.